So what lied behind extractive economic institutions was a program to redistribute wealth towards people who were politically powerful. Okay, so in this case, in the South African case, who was it who organised this system? It was white people. White people were the only people who had any kind of political power. In 1994, the society democratised. Black people got to vote, and of course, the economic institutions of apartheid couldn't persist after that change. So it's clear in the South African case that the politics of these institutions is critical, and more generally, the book sort of emphasised these political structures lying behind economic structures. So if you want to have inclusive economic institutions, you need to have inclusive political institutions, and we emphasise two things. One, which I'm sort of alluding to in the South African case, is to have inclusive economic institutions, you need to have political power sufficiently broadly distributed in society, but you also need to have what we call political centralisation, by which I mean an effective central state. So let me try to talk a little bit. I'm going to use one more slide. In some sense, this is the book I don't want to go on too long. This is the book in a nutshell. It sort of says, if I look around the world today, and I look at countries that are poor, they tend to have extractive economic institutions underpinned by extractive political institutions. And if I look at economically successful countries, they tend to be in this cell of the matrix with inclusive economic institutions underpinned by inclusive political institutions. Of course, this dichotomy is very simplistic. There's lots of shades of grey in reality. So this is just really to kind of develop the argument. But I think the argument in the book is to sort of say, we have one chapter where we say why nations fail today, where we look at a whole bunch of different societies, including Egypt, Uzbekistan, Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, Colombia, Argentina, North Korea, and we say, look, these places are all very heterogeneous. They have different histories, there's different details, institutions, different ideologies. But you can see their economic problems as fundamentally stemming from the fact that they have extractive economic institutions underpinned by extractive political institutions. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the dynamics and Egypt, and then I'll shut up. Okay, so that picture at the start was meant to suggest, however, that if we go back in time, everybody was poor, more or less. And these differences that we see in the modern world were not so pronounced. And then something happened. Okay, what was it that happened? Well, in the book, the argument is that what happened is that some societies made this transition from extractive institutions to inclusive institutions. Britain didn't always have inclusive economic institutions. Quite the contrary. It developed those over time. And our argument is that it developed them as a consequence of political revolutions in the 17th century. First of all, it developed inclusive political institutions. And then once inclusive political institutions were established, that eroded the extractive economic institutions. Okay? There's no one path around this matrix. There's no one path from extractive to inclusive. There's examples of other societies that went the other way around. That's, in some sense, an unusual scenario. You can see here that if you create an inclusive political society, there's enormous pressure pushing you towards inclusive economic institutions, like in South Africa. Once the political society was opened up for black people, they pushed for change in economic institutions. If you go around the matrix the other way, the pressures are different. This says you stay with extractive political institutions, but there's a kind of economic opening. So this is a very different sort of transition. This is like the transition in some sense that China's undergone since the 1970s, that the Chinese dictatorship, the communist dictatorship, has liberalized economic institutions, but it's stayed in power. So you have economic transition before you have political transition. And in fact, of course, there's no necessity that you will have political transition. South Korea went round this path, but I guess what we emphasize in the book is that this is not a very reliable path to develop a society. In fact, there's many examples of countries that get into this box here and then go back into this one here. So Argentina, for example, before the First World War, was an example, was a terrifically successful development example with a combination of inclusive economic institutions and extractive political institutions. But that created revolts, it created political instability, and then there was a failed attempt starting in 1916 to try to move to a more inclusive society, which ended up moving the society back in this direction. Basically because the conservative elites who'd previously been in charge were very unhappy with what happened when they tried to liberalize. They couldn't control the system, so they had to bring the military in 1930. So there's no guarantee of moving in this direction. You could just as well move in this direction. And what we emphasize in the book is that these off diagonals are very kind of unstable. So what about China? Well, China is experiencing a period of kind of transitory economic growth, which is created by this movement towards more inclusive economic institutions, but that's not a sustainable situation. So thinking about the transitions, let me end by talking a little bit about Egypt. You might think, so the Arab Spring, how does this fit into this? Well, I think, when we talk about these transitions, we talk about Britain, or we talk about Brazil in the 1970s or 1980s, we talk about lots of different countries. Just like I talked about South Africa, there's a lot of emphasis on conflict. Okay? In South Africa, the transition to democracy and change in economic institutions didn't come, because white people, suddenly woke up one morning and said, of course, some white people were always opposed to the way South Africa was organized, and so this is, but collectively, white people had a very large interest in maintaining these institutions. It wasn't that they collectively woke up one day and said, this is terrible, we've been treating these black people so badly, we're going to have to reform the society. They were forced to liberalize because in the 1970s, starting in 1976 with the Soweto uprising, black people started acting collectively. They were able to kind of articulate their grievances with the system and begin to mobilize and act collectively to combat the system and try to change it. And that, I think, seems to be rather consistent with what happened in the Arab Spring. Prior to the Arab Spring, the regime of President Mubarak in Egypt, I think, or Ben Ali or Colonel Gaddafi, was clearly extractive in a political sense and extractive in an economic sense. In Egypt, this was not a system which created incentives or opportunities for most people. It was a model of sort of crony capitalism where you did well and got contracts and access to resources and opportunities if you had the right connections, and so this creates a lot of inequality and it creates resentment. So the Arab Spring, in some sense, in this figure, is sort of like a transition from extractive to politically inclusive institutions, except with one slight problem. And the problem is, if you look historically, there's always conflict over institutions. So the first chapter of the book, we actually try to tell the whole story of the book and introduce all the elements talking about the comparative history of the North and South America. And South America appears as kind of North Korea, let's say. And South America is also, it's a country with had enormously extractive institutions historically, very high levels of inequality which have persisted over time. But South America is also the continent of revolution and civil war. So there have been endless conflicts over institutions, rewriting the constitution here, rewriting the constitution there, this model, that model, another civil war. I do a lot of research in Colombia in South America, and Colombia's had an ongoing civil war, since the late 1940s, which you could think of as being a never-ending conflict over institutions. That featured rewriting the constitution heavily in 1991. That didn't do a slightest bit of good. I always tell my Colombian friends or my Latin American friends, you're also obsessed with rewriting the constitution, even though you've seen that for 200 years it hasn't helped you. So it can't just be conflict or even successful conflict, meaning there was many successful revolutions in Latin America, the Sandinista Revolution, the Mexican Revolution, the Bolivian Revolution, the Cuban Revolution. There have been many revolutions where people contesting power have won, but they didn't seem to lead to an inclusive society. So you can't assume that a contest of power or a revolt or a revolution which is successful will necessarily create an inclusive society. So what's the difference between a revolution that creates an inclusive society or one which just leads, to use a concept from sociology, to elite circulation? One elite replaces another elite, and the whole thing basically goes on with new faces at the top. The Who. I don't know. Most of you are too young to know who the English rock group The Who were, but they had a wonderful song called Won't Get Fooled Again, and that's exactly all about the iron law of oligarchy. If you listen to the last line on iTunes of Won't Get Fooled Again, it's about the iron law of oligarchy or elite circulation, but in the workplace rather than at this level. So what is it that, what is it that would determine whether or not you get elite circulation or a transition to a more inclusive society? And in the book what we talk about is, well, what really seems to matter is the nature of the conflict and who's involved in the conflict. So think about, Egyptian history, think about, Colonel Nasser and his coup, his officers' coup in the 1950s. This was not a conflict that was likely to lead to an inclusive society. Why? Because it was a coup d'etat by a narrow military elite. The Bolshevik putsch in 1917 was very unlikely to create an inclusive society in the Soviet Union. It was one sort of vanguard party attempting to replace the old elite and create a different society with itself at the top. Okay? So what seems to distinguish much more fundamental transitions is that they are composed of much broader social movements, so much broader mobilization of people in society. So the ones that were successful in creating inclusion, what the terminology we use in the book is that they comprise this broad coalition. So why is that? I think there's lots of different mechanisms, and I don't know whether these mechanisms are or are not effective in Egypt. Let me give you just one example from British history. So 1688 was this thing called the Glorious Revolution in Britain, which led to this very fundamental transition in politics. And this was a broad coalition. It was a very diverse group of people from across the political spectrum, elites, non-elites, Whigs, Tories, the kind of nascent political parties. They kicked out King James II, and they fought against this project of creating this absolutist state. Now, one thing James II did was he kept intervening in legal disputes. If a legal dispute started going against him, he'd intervene and kick the judge out, or he tried to put in a judge who was a friend of his. And people got that's fine, I'm not going to use it much more. People got very upset about this. So you have to mobilize this big coalition. What do? You could sort of do it clientelistically. You could say, if we win, we're going to get the legal decisions we want. We're in now, and James II's out, and that's going to be good for us. And that's, maybe that works in the Bolshevik Party. But if you're trying to mobilize a lot of people in society, that's not very feasible to kind of say, you can't favour everybody at this, So you have to find a more inclusive way of getting people mobilised. And the way they did that was really by offering something which ended up looking like the rule of law. We don't like James II. This is terrible. We're going to establish this principle that everybody gets access to fair process, equality before the law. And that was something that came out of the Glorious Revolution as a consequence of the strategy they used for mobilizing people. And once you'd established that principle, it was very difficult for some subset of society to kind of undermine it or abandon it. So that's just one example of the kind of mechanisms that we point to in the book. Let me say one last thing so I guess the interesting thing for me to be here is thinking about, this transition in Egypt, is this a transition to more inclusive institutions, or is it an example of elite circulation? Let me just end by saying one very provocative thing. I've been around giving talks in Lebanon and here and Cairo and Alexandria, and I know everyone's really obsessed with religion in the Middle East, and that's absolutely fine. But let me say, if you looked at political conflict in British history, it's all about religion as well. In fact, the Glorious Revolution, after the Glorious Revolution, they wrote this thing called the Declaration of Rights, and then it was signed into law as the Bill of Rights. Some historians would say, the most important thing about the Bill of Rights was it stopped Catholics becoming King of England. Forget all this stuff about civilian control of the military, or Parliament sitting all the time, or sorting out fraud in elections. That's not really important. What's really important is that Catholics couldn't be King or Queen of England. And religion was very powerful in the debates, in the conflict. People used religious argument, they appealed to religious. So you could look at what went on and you'd be really overwhelmed, especially if you read what contemporaries said about religion and how religion was so crucial for understanding this. But I guess my view is if you step back and you ask, what was really important about the consequences of the Glorious Revolution, You know, I guess, you know, people do care about religion and they have religious values, and that's fine. And, you know, and perhaps that was important from that point of view. But for the broader dynamics of the society, in particular for the way the polity and economy evolved, it was much more the change in political institutions that was crucial, rather than the religious aspects of the conflict. So I know that's, you know, that's probably very controversial to say that here, but I think it's worth bearing in mind, you know, when you think about, you know, these issues. All right, I shut up now. Okay.